We are gathered in the home this afternoon of Mr. and Mrs. John Henry Dale, Jr. in Hillcrest Heights, Maryland, to review the Dale Patterson family histories and to include in that history all that can be recalled about the early settlement of Anacostia by these two families and other families. The Dale family history begins long before the Civil War, when three families from North Carolina and one from Mississippi went to Detroit. From North Carolina went Wiley Reynolds, Whitney Reynolds, and David Dale with their wives and children. Dale's wife being the sister of Wiley and Whitney Reynolds. The two brothers and their sister bought jointly a truck farm not far from what was then the city line of Detroit. Becoming dissatisfied with location and conditions, they resolved to sell the farm and divide the proceeds equally. This they did. Wiley, who had been a farmer in North Carolina, went over to Windsor, Canada, and bought a small farm near that town on which he lived and prospered. Whitney, who knew nothing about farming but was a cooper by trade, moved into the city of Detroit and opened a cooper shop in which he and 4 or 5 men who worked for him had regular employment. The sister and her older children did whatever work they could in order to make the money received from the sale last as long as possible, and thus managed to meet expenses, which of course included rent for the house they had taken in the city. The husband and father, David Dale, was a shiftless man who contributed little or nothing to the support of his family. Finally, he left them to seek his fortune in the West. They never again saw him nor heard anything about him. So much for the Reynolds families and the Dale family number 1. The family that went from Mississippi was Isaac Williams, his wife Harriet, and a child Mary. They went to Cincinnati, where they lived until Isaac Williams, who had become a minister, was appointed pastor of the AME Church in Detroit. Meanwhile, Marcus, son of David Dale, had grown up and was employed in the cooper shop of his uncle, Whitney Reynolds, in which he had learned his trade. He was an active member of the church, to which Isaac Williams came as pastor, and in a year or two was married to the pastor's daughter. I have their marriage certificate. Thus began the Dale family number 2. In it were 7 children, namely John Henry, Charles, Wesley, David, Isella, Lillian, Nora, and Juliet. In a period of 13 years, father and mother lived in Detroit, where John and Charles were born. In Oberlin, Ohio, where David was born. In Haiti, in Detroit, again where Isella and Lillian were born, and moved in 1867 to Cypremore, Louisiana, where Nora and Juliet were born. Marcus Dale was sent in 1867 to Cypremore, Louisiana by the Freedmen's Bureau to organize and teach in a school, the first to be organized there. In addition to the schoolwork, he organized an independent Methodist church. In 1874, he resolved to join the Louisiana Methodist Episcopal Conference and advised the Cypremore Church to do likewise in order, he said, that he might always have a competent man for pastor. They did so, and at the next annual conference, Reverend W.P. Forrest, one of the ablest preachers in the conference, was sent to Cypremore, and Dale was sent to Union Chapel in New Orleans. The following 19 years of his life were spent in the ministry. The first member of that family to pass away was Lillian, who died 2 days after we arrived in Cypremore. She was less than 2 years old. The we in this case is John Henry Dale Sr., who is now giving this narration here. The first member, 25 years later, father passed away, and then mother, the father being Marcus Dale. David, Charles, Nora, and Isella, in the order named. 2 of the family are living, namely John H. Sr., that was when this was written, the oldest child, and Juliet, the youngest. Now, Dale family number 3 began with the marriage of John Henry Dale Sr. and Araminta Eugenia Sims in a little hamlet in Harrison County, Mississippi. The first child, Marcus, was born there. We moved to Pass Christian, where Bertie, Mary, Ada, John Henry Sr., Jr., and Roland were born. From there, the family moved to Anacostia, D.C., where Rachel, Inez, and Eunice were born. There were 11 links in this family chain, the most important one of which was the first to be removed, when Eugenia, wife and mother, was called away 40 years after her marriage. 11 years later, another link was taken when Ada quietly went away. 6 years later, still another link was removed when Marcus changed his place of residence. In about 57 years, 3 had crossed the bar. 8 of us survived, the youngest of whom is 35 and the oldest 78 years old. Written by John Henry Dale Sr. Cut it. Do you have the date on that? All right, well.
Let's see. I got a paper clip. Let me see now. I got his letter.
All right, well, you want, so, Dad, would you tell them a little about that trip that your father organized to bring the family from Pass Christian, Mississippi, up here? Or would you like to tell them anything about the stories that Grandpa, who was John Henry Dale Sr., told you about the night riders in Mississippi and how they would have to run for their lives on occasion, because what he was doing there was teaching, and that was forbidden in that day.
Well, he was teaching school. Father was teaching school. His father was a preacher. And the white people at that time said if they could get rid of the nigger school teacher and preacher, they could handle the rest of them. My father and his father was threatened with lynching at least twice, according to what my father has told me. And in each instance, they were warned by a German woman, a white woman, and they left the county for several days until things quieted down. Before they moved to Mississippi, however, I won't go back to that.
Yes, tell us.
Well, when we had the riots in Washington, a lot of people said, why did they burn? Why did they have fire? This man Reynolds, who had this cooper shop in Detroit, and at that time, they were not taking any Negro men into the army in the Civil War. And the place was made up of foreigners, Polish and whatnot, And they became angry because they were taking their sons into the army and were not taking the Negro boys. And so they began to try to retaliate against the Negroes that were living there. And one of them was my grandfather, who had this cooper shop. And they decided they were going to lynch him. And on a certain day, they formed a mob and went down to his shop and called for him to come out. Those men had lived in a certain fear every day. They had guns lying on the counter or wherever they were working, and they had been told by my granduncle that when they come, you be sure you get one of them before they get you. And so they worked with arms right beside them. And on this particular day, they came and called for them to come out. I want to show you how far back this fire business goes with me. They didn't come out. They begun shooting into the building from the front. And of course, they were well armed inside, and they returned the fire. Finally, somebody went in the back of the building and set on fire. That's where fire comes in to me in this rioting business. And, of course, then they had to come out. Now, he only
Was that in Detroit?
That was in Detroit. Before they went to Mississippi. And when they finally came out, because of the heat, the fire, they couldn't stay any longer, they beat them with clubs, in particular my grandfather. And he came out of the building and started stumbling down the street. And he got a little ways away from the shop, and there was a woman standing at her gate. And this also was a German woman. And she pulled the gate open and told him to come in. He fell inside the gate. And she fell on top of him and dared any of them to touch her. So that ended that. They didn't get a chance to lynch anybody in that particular instance, but it shows how this fire business comes in the case of rioting.
Okay.
That's what happened up on 14th Street and other places. Just started the fire. The riot started the fire.
All right. Now, so now in Mississippi,
yeah,
when my great grandfather, no, it's my great grandfather, Marcus Dale, went to Mississippi.
Yeah.
Was sent there by the Freedmen's Bureau
right.
to preach and teach.
Yeah.
All right. Now, he took his family there, and what happened with them down there?
Well,
you have told me many times about remembering Pinchback and Revels.
Yeah, well, my father, of course, he remembered them.
Mm-hmm.
And he remembered Senator Revels on one of these occasions when they came to, they were then in Mississippi past Christian. They came with the intention of lynching the preacher and the school teacher. And this woman had warned my great-grandmother that they were coming and told her to have them to leave until things cooled off. And when they were on their way down the road, my father and his father, preacher and teacher, they saw a man ahead of them way down the road. They finally caught up with him, of course, because they were driving a horse. And they found it was Senator Revels. And he was barefoot, shoes slung across his shoulder. My grandfather asked him where he was going. He said, "I'm making it to the swamp." That was a time when this Reconstruction was being fought by the rebels there. And when all of these men, Pinchback, My father knew Pinchback. He was lieutenant governor of Louisiana. He knew Senator Revels. And all of those men were being put out of office. I don't remember the story, but it had something to do with a man, I think his name was Johnson, had become president. And he had agreed with the rebels in the South that if he would take the Union soldiers out, that they would do something for him as president. He did that. He took them out, and when he took soldiers out, all hell broke loose. Ku Klux Klan sprung up, and all of those black men who had held office in legislature and whatnot were driven out, and Revels was one of them on his way down the road, running from these people who had taken over the government again.
Now, tell us how Grandfather Dale, who was John Henry Dale Sr., came up to Washington and what he did to bring his family up.
That's a miracle. My father was a school teacher in Pass Christian in another county, Harrison County, I believe it was. He taught 12 months a year. And one day coming from school, he stopped at the country store and picked up a country paper. And in that paper was an advertisement, I call it, from the civil service in Washington, D.C., that an examination for a clerkship in the pension bureau, they called it then, the building is still there at 5th and G Street, would be held a certain date. My father took the examination and was certified in less than 30 days. He came to Washington and left his family in Pass Christian. And after his first payday possibly, he sent money back to the station master in Pass Christian, with whom he had made arrangements before he left, that this station master would see that my mother and 6 children were put on a train and sent to Washington. That's been about 80 years ago. And you know what, possibly you have heard, what the so-called Jim Crow situation was then. But that station master then, 80 years ago, put my mother and 6 children in a Pullman out of Mississippi and sent us to Washington without having to get off the train. And
told her not to open the door.
She told us, don't open the door, don't let those children come out. I'll have porters to come and see to all your wants, and if there's anything you need before he comes around and makes his usual rounds, you ring the bell. Don't let him come out there. Don't let anybody see him. And that's the way we came from Mississippi 80 years ago, 6 of us and the mother, during possibly the worst of the Jim Crow business in this country.
Now, did you come directly to Anacostia then?
No.
Where did you go first?
Moved on 13th Street, Northwest, somewhere in the neighborhood of Florida Avenue. I don't know. He never told me the number. But we were only there about maybe 2 years from what he has told me. And then we moved to Anacostia on Howard Road. And after about 5 or 6 years on Howard Road, he moved on Nichols Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King Avenue.
Did he build that house?
He
the
built
big
that house
on Nichols Avenue.
He drew the plans and supervised the building, got off from work and came home during the day to see what the contractors were doing. Came home when it first started one day and found out that the bricklayer had not gone down low enough, and he made him take the bricks out and dig down deeper. That house is gone now. It's been torn down.
Mr. Dale, can you tell us why your family left Northwest Washington? I suspect that would have been Boundary Avenue then. It's called Florida Avenue now. Why they left and moved to Anacostia? What caused them to settle there?
Only reason I can give you is that at that time, Washington was practically white. All white inhabitants, residents. And most of the colored that were there were in Washington at that time were ex-slaves. And their being in Washington was the reason that Anacostia, or Bear Farm, was finally founded, and they were moved out and moved over to Anacostia.
Which was then called Uniontown? That would have been when was
No,
that?
Well, Uniontown was already settled when we came. The Indians were living there at that time. And
can you remember where it was?
Where
Uniontown? Do you know generally where the boundaries of Uniontown were?
Well, I would say Uniontown at that time was from the river west up to Alabama Avenue, and from St. Elizabeth on the south over that way to Pennsylvania Avenue now.
That was
extended.
All Uniontown.
That was all Uniontown. And then they changed the name from Uniontown to Anacostia. During that time, there was a freight station, and for a long time, it remained and was known as Uniontown. Freight came up to that area through Uniontown Station.
And the Uniontown was that because this was settled by the Union, the people who were for the Union in the Civil War?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but it was settled by white people. I'll tell you that much.
Can you tell us where that freight station was?
It was, of course, there was a railroad freight that ran right along beside it that stopped there. And that would be the river, Anacostia River.
And the freight station itself was
The same railroad siding
where?
that's there now?
Down on Railroad?
It isn't there now.
No.
I don't think. I don't think it is.
Okay.
Anyway, the name was changed from Anacostia,
From Uniontown.
from Uniontown to Anacostia. And all of that area was white people.
Mr. Dale, I have read that Uniontown ran from what would now be Good Hope Road up to Morris Road, and that beyond that was called Hillsdale.
That's correct.
All right. What, you spoke about the Indians being there. There are two or three things I want to touch on. You spoke about the Indians. Was there a relationship between the blacks and the Indians who resided in the area?
No, not that I know of. Not that I have ever been told. There was a relationship between the Indians and the white people who lived in Uniontown, or in Anacostia, as they called it.
Now, when your family first moved to Anacostia, they lived on Howard Road.
Right.
Would that have been in housing developed by the Freedmen's Bureau?
No. All that ground was owned by Negroes. on Howard Road, Sumner Road, Stevens Road, Nichols Avenue from Talbot Street up to St. Elizabeth, and then going east, Sheridan Road, Stanton Road, Alabama Avenue, was all Negroes.
I understand that blacks lived in that area, but those streets that you've named, Sheridan Road, Howard Road, Sumner Road, wasn't all of that part of the original Uniontown package? I'm sorry, not Uniontown, but Barry Farms, developed by the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah, that is. That was, still is. But it does not take in below there, which was called Anacostia. See? Now, when they changed the name from Uniontown, the white people who lived there, they changed I don't know what to do with that thing.
That's all right, Mr. Dale, you're doing beautifully.
Mm.
Yeah.
When they changed the name from Uniontown to Anacostia, at that time, they begun to send the Negroes over into this area that at first, let me see now. Yeah. They had decided to get us out of Washington. And this General Howard in the Army came over to this area south of Anacostia, and he bought ground from a man by the name of Barry. And they decided to send Negroes over there. There wasn't nothing there, no Howard. In that whole area from Howard Road up to St. Elizabeth, there wasn't a dozen houses. And after he came over and surveyed and recommended that the government buy this property, they begun sending the ex-slaves from Washington out there to settle. Of course, my father came few years after that first began. There had been others there before his time, but there weren't many at his time, during his time. And there was no such thing as housing. The story goes that the government gave each ex-slave $200, enough to build 2 rooms, and he was supposed to pay that money back, I guess. I've never been able to dig into that because no ex-slave at that time had any $200, I don't think. So that may have been just
No, the
front.
government was to give them the $200.
Yeah, to build 2 rooms.
Let me ask you this, because one of the things that we're curious about is the moving of Frederick Douglass into Uniontown. Now, in the research, we're told that there were only 2 black families living in Uniontown, Frederick Douglass and one who has remained unnamed. Do you know who that second black family was, Mr. Dale?
Well, Miss Solomon G. Brown, he was one of the old ones.
Yeah, he was about the oldest. Well, Brown didn't live in Uniontown.
No, he lived on
What is
on
Elvin? What is now Elvin Road? Of course, none of those streets were named back there in those days. Sumner Road, Howard Road, none of them were named until later, when more of the Negroes came from Washington, or they were sent out there from Washington to be settled. And the agreement or the understanding was with Howard, General Howard, and the Freedmen's Bureau that no white person could buy any of that land. But as they begun to settle more freely and with no work and whatnot, the, what do you call them, speculators, crooks, moved in and begun loaning these people small sums of money, which they could never pay back, did never pay back, and eventually they took over the ground.
They lost the land.
Lost the land. And I guess right now,
That's going on right today.
going on right today, and the majority, the biggest portion of that land in that particular area is now owned by white men.
Mr. Dale, is the home built by your father on Nichols Avenue still standing?
No, I'm sorry to say it is not. It was torn down, it was sold to a church congregation, and I've never been able to find what they planned to do with it, but it stood for more than a year, and they began to vandalize it so that they finally tore it down. Nothing is there now but the lot, the piece of ground.
But isn't it true that your family lived in the house until the Frys bought it?
That's right.
So that only two families actually lived in that piece of property, and it was called Sycamore. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry. Yeah, 2619 Nichols Avenue, and only two families lived in that house for, what, 100 years, I guess it was? Something close to that.
I guess, yes. Yeah, I guess you would say.
All right, Mr. Dale, your father was a teacher by profession. Where did he pick up the skills necessary to build his home?
Well, I say, have said and still say, he was one of the most remarkable men that I've ever heard of, not seen. He did not go to college. Matter of fact, so far as I know, he has told me he didn't even finish high school. But he taught himself. And after the children grew up and some of them were starting in high school, he'd sit down at night and work out problems that we couldn't work out, and get up in the morning and explain how it came about to be this. Never went to college, to just a gift, God's gift, I say. And of course, when he was teaching school in the South, there were country schools, and you know what some of them are now. So that didn't mean too much to be a teacher in a country school in those days in Mississippi.
Except that he had learned to read and write and was able to teach others.
Mr. Dale, isn't it true, however, that the teachers and preachers who went south very often through under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau were the stability of the black communities in which they landed and were the source of hope and inspiration for the people that they were serving?
That is quite true. They were, and that was the reason they were sent there. Some of them were dedicated and did good jobs. Some of them were not dedicated and sold out to the white man, so to speak, so that they could exist. It has often been said, I don't know whether you've heard it in these modern days or not, that the white man in the South has said, "You all up north, let us alone. We know how to handle a nigger." And that was the way he handled them. Many of them were traitors. And those few that went there and did help, did it the risk of their lives. There weren't many of them. There were a few white people who went at that time. Later on, down through the years, particularly, I must say, they were women, dedicated white women, who went there and helped to teach Negro of that day how to read and write.
All right. Something of interest that you said that relates to the period of Reconstruction and the presidency of Andrew Johnson. At the time, the government was concerned about the readmission of the southern states. There was a man who was becoming very vocal on the scenes named Charles Sumner. What kind of impact did Sumner make on the blacks that your grandfather and father knew?
In those days, as you know, communication was very sparse. And Sumner, as I understand, was a man, as I recall, who lived up in Massachusetts, did he?
The senator.
Yeah, that's a long ways from Mississippi.
But he was in Washington at this time.
Yeah, well, that's a long ways from Washington, Mississippi. And with the media, the newspaper, and telephone, and all that stuff, wasn't hard to get anything good from Washington, or it took a long time. And when it got down there, they just let what they wanted to be made known. They had said, and said all the time, let us alone, we know how to handle him. So they told the Negro this, that, and the other. They were his friend, and that's the way it went.
During that time, there was the emergence of the colonization movement. Did your father or grandfather know of any families personally that took advantage of this offer to be transported back to Africa to settle in Liberia?
No, so far as I know, I never heard my father say anything about this going back to Africa business. As a matter of fact, the white man had taken over the government and become so firmly entrenched, he wasn't thinking about sending them back. He wanted to work on the farms and raise cotton and whatnot. That were the principal things, commodities raised in that time. I never heard him say anything about that. And of course, as I say, he left there. I didn't give him the date about that, but all I'm going on, I'm 84 years old now. And I was told that he moved to Washington a year before we settled, or before he went to Howard Road. I was 4 years old when he moved to Howard Road, so he came to Washington 2 or 3 years ahead of that, 80 years ago. He didn't write those dates down. 87. And I don't know whether this would be of any interest, but I like to talk about it, to tell about it. The mysterious way in which he got this clerkship 80 years ago from Mississippi. A Negro from Mississippi passed the examination and was sent to Washington to take over a job as a clerk in that red building there at 5th and D Street, pension office, they called it at that time. He got the job. He never got a promotion till the Second World War, when they gave all employees what they called then a bonus of $440. But he started out with that $1,000. And he never got any more till he got the $440. And still he was assigned to a job that was so important, I suppose they call it now top secret stuff, that there were only two of them, he and a white man, in a room to themselves. And when one was off, the other couldn't get off except it was an extreme emergency, but he never got any raise. He was working for $1,000 and the white man was getting $1,800 a year. That's what I like to talk about.
Pension office.
That's a pension office. So the inequity that existed then as it does now. He and the white man working side by side. White man getting $800 a year more than he was getting.
Now, do you want to go back to Anacostia a little? How many, when you moved to Anacostia up to Nichols Avenue, do you recall how many people there were owning land in then what was then known as Barry Farms? Was it known as Barry Farms when you built the house there?
Yeah. Well, there's a mix-up there in this Anacostia and Barry Farm business. Whenever a group of people moved to a certain area, they formed what they call a citizens association. Now, down lower, as I say, down there Good Oak Road, where the white people live, they had changed their name to Anacostia, and it was definitely Anacostia. Now, when the colored people began to move in up above Talbot Street, they took the name of Hillsdale to begin with. And they soon formed a civic association, which I think we have proven was the first civic association in the district in Washington, D.C., Hillsdale Civic Association. Then another group of them moved back up on the hill there, and they called it, what I mean back up on the hill going toward Alabama Avenue, they called that Stanton Town. The first...
Who were some of the names? What were some of the names of people in the Stanton Town development?
Solomon G. Brown.
How about Lawyer Lewis?
Well, yes, Lawyer Lewis. He was up on Alabama Avenue.
Was he in Alabama Avenue?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that finally, they changed when Lewis moved in. Then they got a group together and called the Garfield Citizens Association.
That's the father of Professor Harold Lewis at Howard University History Department now.
And in Hillsdale, we had a man who was house painter. A lot of these folks, their parents that came from the South, had learned these various trades: barbers, bricklayers, painters. And their children just took over, never went to school, never learned the trade, but just could do it as good and better than many others who'd gone to school. This man Jackson that I speak of was a painter, house painter. Most houses in those days in Washington were frame houses, called for painting every couple of years or so. That's the way he made his living. He had several men who worked for him as a painting contractor, they later called him.
What was his name?
Alan Jackson.
And he was the father of Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Allen Jackson.
Alan Jackson, correct.
Two doctors.
Both of them have passed. And to say all that property
Now, tell us about the some names from the Barry Farms. Did we get the Barry Farms yet, or is this Hillsdale now and Stantontown? Stantontown, you gave us Brown.
The other way, really, the way Barry Farms came in as an association. Everything had gone along, and it was known as Hillsdale, Stantontown, and Garfield. And there was a man showed up in the Hillsdale area by the name of Hoffman. And
Elsie
Hoffman. And he stirred them up in the Hillsdale Association by telling them that the Hillsdale was doing nothing for the group that lived up on the hills there in the area of what is now Elvin Road and Stanton Road. And they pulled out. They left the Hillsdale Civic Association, and it was an easy matter for them to pick up a name because that whole area had been bought by a man named Barry. And they called themselves the Barry Farm Civic Association and claimed that they were the rightful citizen association because the fact came from the name of the man who had sold the ground to them. But anyway.
Just a minute. Was he black? Was he a Negro? Barry?
Barry, no, he was a white man. He'd bought up acres of that ground down there sometime before or during the Civil War. And at the time that General Howard bought the farm from him, there was only one house and a barn standing on all that area down there from Talbot Street to Nichols Ave to St. Elizabeth, and from the river over to Alabama Avenue. Just a farm. They called it Barry Farms.
Now, was that the same land that was then given to the ex-slaves?
That's right. Yeah, he's given is right, but they were supposed to pay $200 to get an acre of ground, enough lumber to build 2 rooms. And my thought has been that that just went down on paper because they didn't expect those people to pay that money, $200, and so paper shows that that's what happened in the transaction.
The people who settled in Barry Farms, Mr. Dale, did they acquire deeds to their property?
So far as I know, there were no deeds given to them. They were just given a piece of paper showing that they had an acre of ground and enough lumber to build 2 rooms. There were no surveyors in those days. It was years afterward before they ever started to survey in that area. You walked it off. Man got out there and took so many strides down this way, 3 feet, and so many down that way. There was no, even the house that we bought on Sumner Road in late years, I would say 10, 15 years before we left there was a mix-up because the property had been sold before surveyors came about, and they claimed that where we lived, we were 3 feet over on the person's ground who lived on the corner. But we went to court. My brother-in-law carried it into court, and the court gave us 3 more feet than we did have. They had begun surveying then, see. But in those days, there were no surveyors. There was no thing. I've looked to find. The only thing I can find.
Well, excuse me, honey. But John Bruce had lived there a long time before we bought the property, you know.
I'm getting around to that now.
Oh,
May I include here some reflections from Will Smoot, who was one of the old citizens here, and he indicates in this written reflections and impressions that the community known as Hillsdale came into being as one of the immediate results of the war between the states in the following manner. In the latter stages of the war, in order to disrupt the economic system of the rebel states, slaves being held as property were declared contraband of war. Under this military order, large numbers of confiscated slaves were evacuated to Washington, together with their meager possessions. Being entirely without means of support, they became wards of the federal government. Barrack-like structures were erected as temporary shelters on the wastelands then existing east of the capital, and army rations were issued for their sustenance. Many of these freed slaves were experienced as barbers, cooks, waiters, and house servants, etc., and thus found ready employment. But large numbers had no experience except as farm laborers, and thus did not fit readily into the cosmopolitan life of the city. In order to free the federal government of this burden and to ensure the future of these dependent people, the Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865 with General Oliver Otis Howard, a veteran of the Army, as its chief. Among the projects sponsored by this bureau were Freedmen's Hospital, Howard University, and an ill-starred enterprise known as the Freedmen's Bank. But most important in its bearing upon the fortunes and destinies of these indigent freedmen was the advance of a large sum of money by the government, which was spent under the supervision of General Howard for the purchase of 3 farms east of the Potomac River, namely the Talbot Farm, Barry, and Stanton Farms. These farms contained large tracts of woodland. The terrain was rugged and hilly, interspersed with level and fertile areas. Surveys were made, roads indicated, and the whole area was laid out in 1-acre parcels. Labor was recruited from among these freedmen for the felling of trees and the opening of roads. They were paid regular wages, but the Bureau wisely stipulated that each man thus employed must purchase a home site of 1 acre to be paid for by deductions from his wages. The money thus deducted went to reimburse the federal government for the sum advanced for the original purchase. Sawmills were set up to convert the hewn timber into to usable labor, and each purchaser of a home site was allotted sufficient lumber for a small dwelling. The Barry and Stanton farms were set aside for the exclusive settlement of Negro freedmen, while the Talbot farm was open for the exclusive benefit of whites, and that's what later became Anacostia.
That's it.
Well, there may be some more there.
In the research that we've done on the Barry Farms area, the story is told that Mr. Barry would not deal directly with the blacks who wished to settle there and for whom the land was going to be purchased, the 375-acre tract, and that a Senator Pomeroy had to act as an agent for these blacks in securing the land. Is that fairly typical of the relationship, the race relations, the black-white relationship of that time?
Well, I haven't any information concerning that. What she has just, some of it she's read, and there's still some more there. This man Smoot, I think has more information on what did happen, and well, maybe before we ever came to their family ever came to Anacostia. So I don't know whether the man who owned the ground refused to deal with them as individuals or not. I don't know whether he was that smart and that tricky back in those days, but it was good things. That he wanted something concrete. to the extent that he preferred dealing with General Howard, who represented the government, than dealing with individuals. Also knowing that they had very little, if anything. If they came over as individuals and wanted to buy a tract of ground from them, I wouldn't much blame them for not selling it to them.
It's also been indicated, Mr. Dale, that there was great hostility in the white community when it came to selling land to blacks for the purpose of building schoolhouses. Can you tell us, if you know, the names of any black families who sold land for that specific purpose, for building schools?
I can't tell you whether the ground on which the first school that I know of was built. I can't tell you who owned that ground. First school, public school, built in Hillsdale, I put it that way, was built there on Nichols Avenue, now Martin Luther King, just above Howard Road. And it was known as the Hillsdale Public School. Big frame building, about at least eight rooms in it, frame building. And I would say maybe 10 years, more or less, after that was built, they finally got the Burney School, which was on the ground where the Burney School is now.
That would be the second Burney School.
First Burney School was a frame building.
Right.
They moved the frame building back years later and built what is there now called what do they call that?
They call it the Nichols Avenue.
Nichols Avenue School.
That's right.
Now that was the first brick school. And the back part of that building was put on later. It wasn't all built at the same time. And that building was condemned some years ago, stopped sending children there. Then they came along a few years later and put children back in there. And it's still there. It's still in there. See? So then they bought ground adjacent to that on Shannon Place and built this new one now, Syfax.
The Savoy.
Savoy. That's right.
Mr. Dale, we've been able to identify where the Hillsdale School was built. Now, also in the research, I discovered the name Howard, that there was a Howard School built. Do you know anything about it or its location?
Howard School? Never heard of it. All that I know about is the Hillsdale that I've told you, a big frame building on Nichols Avenue, and the Burney School. And there were two of those. First was frame, then came the brick, and now the Savoy that's adjacent to it. Never heard of Howard School?
Okay. All right. Let's be more specific now in terms of your schooling, your own personal schooling, growing up in Anacostia, the churches that you attended, and as a young man, the organizations that you became associated with.
Never attended but one church. I still belong there. I've been a member there for about 75 years. Now,
so that church?
Campbell. A-M-E.
Now, did your father belong to the M.E. Church in Mississippi?
Right. He was M.E. All of us was M.E. Wasn't any A.M.Es down there in those days. He was M.E. And when he came to Washington and moved to Anacostia, there was no M.E. church in Anacostia, so he joined the Campbell, A.M.E.
Have you been in the church in New Orleans where the plaque is there to our great-grandfather, Marcus Dale?
Yeah.
Did I tell you about that?
I've been there.
Is that still called Union, M.E.?
Time I was there, that's been 20 years ago or more, and it was still known as Union M.E. Church. And in those days, because of what he did for the Negro people, they broke precedent whether they knew it or not, and hung a big portrait of him in the back of the church over the pulpit. I've been there and seen that for myself.
And you know that I spoke there.
Yeah, I was told that before I went there. I was told that before I went there, and I made it my business to go there.
Globetrotter in the family.
Yeah, she was a globetrotter and crazy with it.
Now, come on.
She went down, the reason I say that jokingly, she went down to Alabama. Of course, this was, I think, before.
Well, now, don't get on to
Okay,
that
all
now.
right.
Okay. No, all right.
Let's get him back on the track
get back
now.
on to
All right,
you.
Mr. Dale. Yeah, we're going to deal with Thelma at another time. Mr. Dale, we know that you went to the old Bernie School, and Thelma has also told us that you went to the M Street High School.
That's correct.
Of course, we know there's a great deal of distance between Anacostia and the M Street High School. We've also heard that Frederick Douglass walked to the district building. Now, you tell us how you got to school.
Sometimes, and most of the time, we walked to or from school at least. And having to walk from school in particular was due to the fact that our parents weren't able to give us the 5 cents to buy a hot dog for lunch like a lot of the children, and we'd save our ticket, which we got in that day, the car fare, and buy a hot dog once in a great while for lunch.
And then walk from M Street.
Oh yeah. If you spent that money for the hot dog, you walked home because they didn't give you no extra.
And in those days, they had this ice cream that's called Hokey Pokey, you know. Hokey Pokey ice cream. We want some of it. You know, we take our car fare and buy a little cone or something, and then walk on home.
All right, so now you went to M Street High School for how long?
2 years.
Do you remember who was the principal then?
At the time that I was there, I think it was the late Judge Terrell. And I think after Terrell was a woman. I got to give you women some of this credit here. Anna Cooper, Anna J. Cooper.
Oh, she's an Anacostian,
Oh,
right?
oh, I don't think so. No, maybe the one you have in mind who played such a big part was Georgiana Simpson.
Yes.
She was.
No, I meant. Oh.
She was never principal, but she was a great educator in those days, and came up way back there. Her father had a small dairy farm back in those days on Howard Road, and had the first brick house that was built.
The Coopers.
No.
Who are you talking
Simpson, Georgiana.
about? Georgiana Simpson.
She went so far as to teach recently. At Howard before she died.
All right. Okay.